At the beginning of the 1972 season, there were three teams running the Wishbone as their primary offense: Texas, Oklahoma, and Alabama. Their success was not lost on the rest of the country. Other teams had started using the Wishbone situationally. Arkansas, for example, began using it in goal line and red zone situations. Woody Hayes installed it right before his Buckeyes played in the '71 Rose Bowl, and he relied on it heavily in that game. Michigan also incorporated the Wishbone during the '71 season. In addition, two more teams became full-fledged Wishbone teams in '72, adding their own variations to the scheme. In spite of the offense's growing influence around the country, the only Wishbone team to have won a championship to that point was Texas. But the offense was still young, and that was about to change. From 1968 to 1971, Texas was on top of the college football world. Then, their arch-rival took their offense and showed them how to run it. And another rival took their offensive coordinator. Texas getting poached by rivals was becoming a pattern. After the 1971 season, Texas A&M fired native son Gene Stallings, who had gone a mere 27, 45, and 1 during his 7 years at the helm. In his place, they hired the architect of the Wishbone himself, Emory Bellard. The turnaround wouldn't be easy. In fact, it didn't look like Bellard would be able to turn them around at all. In his first season as a collegiate head coach, Bellard's team looked overwhelmed, going 3-8 and losing to rival Texas 38-3. The Aggies showed a dramatic improvement in offensive production in '73, but posted another losing record. But in '74, with Bellard's own players in place who could run the bone, Texas A&M went 8-3 with wins over number 7 LSU and number 9 Texas Tech. They still lost to Texas 32-3. Texas continued to run the Wishbone following Bellard's departure. Royals Longhorns had by no means fallen off the map. From 1971 to '74, Texas went 25-3 in Southwest Conference play, going undefeated in conference in 1972 and 1973, thanks mainly to the efforts of All-American running back Roosevelt Leaks. As the bell cow for the Longhorns, he would set the conference's single-game rushing record with 342 yards against SMU. In 1972, the Longhorns were breaking in a new signal caller, but Alan Lowry was up to the task. He piloted the Longhorns to a 10-1 record that year, but it was Leaks who shouldered most of the load, rushing for over 1,000 yards and rushing for 1,400 the next year. Texas, however, couldn't shake Oklahoma, whose Wishbone was a finely tuned machine. In 1972, the Sooners had to replace Jack Mildren at quarterback. Nevertheless, the Sooners would cruise to an 11-1 record, defeating 6 ranked opponents along the way, including beating Texas 27-0. Texas's only loss of the year. Mildren's replacement, Dave Robertson, demonstrated his command of the bone, passing for over 1,000 yards, astronomical for a Wishbone quarterback, and showing consistently good decision-making when running the option. Having the previous year's Heisman runner-up in the backfield didn't hurt either. The Wishbone had also moved out west. Pepper Rogers, head coach at UCLA, decided it would be in the Bruins' best interest to run the new scheme. And he wasn't wrong. In 1971, UCLA went 2-7-1 and averaged a mere 17 points per game. But with the new offensive scheme and a new man under center named Mark Harmon, the Bruins' offense was unrecognizable in '72. Not just because of the scheme, but because of the production. It started with a season-opening upset of top-ranked Nebraska. An embarrassing loss for the Huskers became a springboard for the Bruins. After splitting their next 2 games, the Bruins won their next 6, scoring at least 35 points in 5 of those games. Season-ending losses to Washington and eventual national champion USC would give the Bruins a final mark of 8-3, 6 wins better than 1971. The '72 Bruins averaged 32 points per game, nearly doubling their scoring output from the previous season, and rose as high as number 6 in the AP poll. In 1973, the Bruins would start with a loss to Nebraska, but would then reel off 9 consecutive wins, in which they would score at least 55 points 6 times, before losing the season finale to USC once again. Nevertheless, the Bruins finished second in the nation in scoring offense with 43 points per game. Pepper Rogers would leave Westwood for Atlanta to take the head coaching job at his alma mater, Georgia Tech, in 1974, and he'd bring the bone with him. UCLA didn't get to show off their offensive prowess in a bowl game at the end of either of their 2 years running the Wishbone, because the Pac-8 conference only allowed one team to go to a bowl game each season. But 2 other Wishbone teams got to square off against each other in the Cotton Bowl: Texas and Alabama. Alabama's 72 season looked to be one for the ages, as the Tide ran through the first 5 games on their schedule without a hitch. But Game 6, against 10th-ranked Tennessee, proved to be tougher. The Volunteers seemed to have the Wishbone figured out, as Alabama led only 3-0 at halftime. Tennessee took a 10-3 lead in the third quarter, and Alabama's prospects looked bleak. Being a scheme that's designed to run the ball 90% of the time, the Wishbone wasn't built to come from behind. But that didn't mean it couldn't happen. While passing was an afterthought in the Wishbone, with the right man under center, the passing game could be deadly. The effectiveness of the Wishbone's triple option meant that safeties and cornerbacks had to help in the run game, often leaving defenses in cover zero situations, meaning man-to-man defense across the board. An athletic receiver plus a quarterback with an arm could spell doom for a defense. With just 2.5 minutes left in the game, Alabama marched downfield and scored a touchdown. With only 1:48 left and the game tied at 10, the Tide kicked it deep. Tennessee fumbled and Alabama recovered deep in Vol territory. All they needed was a field goal, but Terry Davis took the game into his own hands, scoring on a 22-yard keeper to give the Tide the lead and the improbable victory. Alabama cruised to the Iron Bowl, which proved to be one of the most memorable in the history of the rivalry. Bama built a 9-0 halftime lead thanks to a Steve Biscaglia touchdown run and a field goal. The Tide tacked on 7 more in the third quarter thanks to Wilbur Jackson's 6-yard run. The Tide were sitting pretty, up 16-0 at the start of the final period. But what goes around comes around. Alabama came back against Tennessee, but Auburn was about to start a bizarre comeback against Alabama. After a field goal cut Bama's lead by 3, Tigers player Bill Newton blocked a punt, and David Langner returned it for a touchdown, cutting the deficit to 7. On the very next possession, the Tide would punt again. Again, the punt was blocked, again by Bill Newton, and returned for a touchdown once again by David Langner. The extra point gave Auburn the lead and the victory. Alabama's chances at a national championship had just gone out the window. But the Tide, as SEC champs, were invited to the Cotton Bowl to take on another Wishbone team, the 9-1 Texas Longhorns, champions of the Southwest Conference. The game would play out in a depressingly familiar fashion for Alabama fans, as the Tide built a 13-3 halftime lead. But in the third quarter, Texas quarterback Alan Lowry would cut the deficit to 3 with a touchdown run, capping off a 15-play, 59-yard drive. Late in the fourth, Lowry would give the Longhorns the lead on a 34-yard run. It had happened to Alabama again. Once again, Alabama snatched defeat from the jaws of victory, and with it went any chance at a national championship. Nevertheless, there was a lot to build on. Bama got off to another hot start in '73. After blowing out Cal to start the season, the Tide found themselves in a dogfight at Kentucky, Bear Bryant's first trip back to Lexington since he resigned from that job in 1953. Alabama found themselves behind 14-0 at halftime, but on the very first play of the third quarter, Willie Shelby took the kickoff back 100 yards, sparking a 21-point third quarter. Shelby scored again on a 2-yard run in the fourth quarter to put the game away. After demolishing Vanderbilt, the Tide found themselves in another close contest, this time against Georgia. After jumping to a 13-3 halftime lead, the Crimson Tide offense stalled. Georgia scored on a safety from a blocked punt and took the lead early in the fourth following a field goal and 8-yard touchdown run. Finally, the Wishbone came to life. The Tide went on a 67-yard march to the Georgia 13 and had the opportunity to take the lead with a field goal, but it was no good. Bama would get another chance, however, taking over with just under 3 minutes remaining. Gary Rutledge then led the Tide on a 59-yard, 3-play touchdown drive, culminating in an 8-yard touchdown run by Rutledge. The Tide led 21-14 following the two-point conversion. After 4 consecutive Bulldog passes fell incomplete, Randy Billingsley provided the icing on the cake with a 17-yard touchdown run. Another come-from-behind victory. Like clockwork, after another relatively easy win, Alabama was once again in trouble at the start of the fourth quarter against 10th-ranked Tennessee. Early in the fourth quarter, Alabama's defense got a much-needed stop, and Robin Carey gave the Tide the lead on a 64-yard punt return. Runs of 80 and 3 yards provided the final margin as Alabama won by a comfortable 3 touchdowns. Alabama had little trouble with the rest of the season, and prior to the bowl games was voted national champion by the UPI poll. Following a loss to Notre Dame in the Sugar Bowl, however, the AP crown would go to the Irish. The Tide finished third in the nation in scoring offense, behind 2 other Wishbone teams, Oklahoma and UCLA. 1973 was the start of an historic streak by Bama, as they would go undefeated in conference play for 3 consecutive seasons, compiling an SEC winning streak of 20 games. In 1974, the Tide would once again go undefeated in the regular season, but would lose to Notre Dame in a bowl game and miss out on another national championship. In 1975, Bama started out with a tough home loss to Missouri, but would make mincemeat of most of the rest of their schedule, including a 28-0 destruction of Auburn and a 7-point victory over Penn State in the Sugar Bowl. The Tide finished 6th in the nation in scoring offense, behind running back Johnny Davis and quarterback Richard Todd, but would once again lose out on a national title, thanks to the other team in crimson. 1972 had been a successful season in Norman, and the fan base was poised for the first national championship run since the Wilkinson years. The next season, however, disaster struck. Chuck Fairbanks, the coach who had the guts to let Barry Switzer scrap the veer and install the Wishbone in the middle of 1970, left to coach the New England Patriots. Following his departure, it was also discovered that 2 Oklahoma players had falsified their high school transcripts, one of whom was Kerry Jackson, who was slated to start at quarterback. The NCAA placed the Sooners on probation for 2 years, meaning no nationally televised games and no bowl games. However, because of the TV contract, the Sooners would be on TV for the 73 season, and the ban would start the following year. But the bowl game ban would start immediately. So the Sooners would be ineligible for bowl games in 73 and 74, and banned from national television for 74 and 75. A 2-year penalty that affected them for 3. Newly appointed head coach Barry Switzer didn't back down from the challenge. If they weren't going to be able to show people how good they were in bowl games, they'd do it in the regular season.
Our goal is to win the Big 8 Conference Championship and challenge for the National. Well, they can't take that away from us.
They found a new quarterback to step in to replace the departed Kerry Jackson, sophomore Steve Davis, who had never taken a collegiate snap, but had the confidence of Switzer. In Week 2 of the 1973 season, OU traveled to LA to take on number 1 USC. The teams battled to a 7-7 tie, a game that Oklahoma dominated in every way except on the scoreboard. It was the most adversity Oklahoma would face all season, as they defeated 6 ranked opponents on their way to a 10-0-1 record. The Sooners dominated the Big 8, beating opponents by an average score of 39-11. OU defeated rivals Texas, Oklahoma State, and Nebraska by a combined score of 124-31. In 1974, Oklahoma was the best team that nobody saw. The Sooners blew through the first 3 opponents on their schedule by a combined score of 163-14. Then it was time for Texas. The 2 Wishbone rivals slugged it out with the Sooners pulling out a 3-point victory. Oklahoma rolled through conference play behind stellar quarterback Steve Davis and silver-shoed halfback Joe Washington, a player that Barry Switzer described as smoke through a keyhole. After running the table, there was no bowl game to go to. The UPI didn't rank teams on probation, but in spite of their postseason ineligibility, the AP declared the Sooners national champions. They had led the nation in scoring at 43 points per game and had beaten their opponents by an average of 34 points. In 1975, the Sooners' key pieces were back on offense, including Joe Washington, Steve Davis, and receiver Tinker Owens. The team once again started strong, beating 4 ranked opponents on their way to an 8-0 start. Then, the unthinkable happened. A complete fluke, a rogue wave in an otherwise calm Crimson Sea. Oklahoma lost to Kansas at home, 23-3. The Sooners fumbled 7 times, threw 2 interceptions, and had 2 kicks blocked by the Jayhawks. It was OU's first loss in 3 seasons. The Sooners, in complete shock, had to try to rebound on the road against a ranked Missouri team. They took out their frustrations on the Tigers early, jumping to a quick 20-0 lead. But Missouri wouldn't go quietly as the Tigers clawed their way back into the game, eventually taking a 27-20 lead. The Sooners' season was slipping away when, on 4th and 1, Steve Davis optioned to the right, tight end Victor Hicks sealed the edge, and Joe Washington took the pitch all the way to the house. OU had to go for 2 to get the win. Once again, Davis optioned right, pitched it to Joe, and Joe stretched the ball across the goal line for the victory, saving Oklahoma's season. OU dispatched second-ranked Nebraska 35-10 before handling Michigan 14-6 in the Orange Bowl, winning a second consecutive national championship. No one could stop Oklahoma's Wishbone. Not Texas, not Nebraska, not probation. The nation had no choice but to acknowledge the Sooners, who were 32-1-1 under Barry Switzer, as the best team in college football. 3 national championships in 3 seasons. 5 national championships in the past 7 seasons. If there was anyone who wasn't taking the Wishbone seriously before, they were now. From 1972 to 1975, Alabama, Texas, and Oklahoma all finished in the top 10 in scoring offense 3 times and went a combined 122, 17, and 1. UCLA finished in the top 10 the only 2 years they ran the Wishbone. So far, every team that had run the Wishbone had done it well, or was at least moving in the right direction. Could these teams keep up their torrid pace? For Oklahoma and Alabama, at least, there was no doubt. As for some of their hapless victims, the decision was easy. If you can't beat them, join them.